throughout the history even of civilization, most of the wealth was accumulated, through kings and priests and so on, at the expense of somebody else. It really was a zero-sum world, and I think we don't live in that world anymore, but our brains do. And that's why, and one reason why we don't trust markets, and people have a difficult time understanding it. For that same reason, they have a difficult time understanding evolution. And so continuing with the parallels, let's say, between Adam Smith and Charles Darwin, I think these are two of the greatest metaphors in the history of Western civilization, the invisible hand and natural selection. We already know and are comfortable with natural selection, but of course, remember, nobody's selecting anything. There's no selective process, and even evolutionary theorists themselves have a really hard time getting around the metaphor language and talking about, like if you read almost any paleoanthropological popular work, they'll describe fossil hominids as like almost human or partially human or halfway human, as if a Australopithecine is on its way to becoming us. And of course, they weren't on their way to becoming anything. They were just trying to make a living and get their genes into the next generation, just like us. I used to try to think of the polar bear as try to think of transitional fossils that are living. And well, the polar bear is a nice transitional fossil between a land mammal and a marine mammal. And oh gosh, maybe if global warming comes, it'll become a marine mammal. But that's completely wrong. It's not becoming anything. It's just a polar bear trying to get something to eat every day and pass its genes on to the next generation. The only thing it might become is extinct, or maybe it'll migrate south and become much more of a land mammal. Who knows? But it's not going anywhere. There's no selection for anything going anywhere. Nevertheless, it's still a useful metaphor. And Darwin's whole business of the pigeon breeding and creationists say, you see, pigeon breeders are intelligent designers of the pigeons. Yes, it's just an analogy of what's actually going on in nature, but there's nobody selecting it. And this is the problem with the invisible hand. We can't help but think, well, you mean like the government's the top-down designer, that's the invisible hand. No. Smith's point was that you don't need any designer. It just spontaneously happens from the bottom up. Now, a couple of myths about Smith. He was not just blindly pro-capitalistic, pro-business. In fact, he was just as skeptical of corporations and businesses as he should have been, because there was, Ralph Nader calls it the corporate welfare. That is, corporations are only too happy to use government largesse when they can get it. And he talked about whenever businessmen meet, even over spirits, adult beverages, and dinner and so on, it isn't long before they begin conspiring against the public to fix prices and so on. Yes, he recognized all that, but his point was that if you want to create a wealthy nation, the wealth of nations, you have to just let people do what they want to do. It's just people running around trying to make a living, just like polar bears and everybody else, and get their genes into the next generation. Out of that spontaneously emerges trade and so on. The more you interfere with that, the more difficult it becomes to accumulate wealth. And so he was debunking the myth of mercantilism. That is, the best way for a nation to become wealthy is to compete in a zero-sum model against other countries. And what Smith was saying is that we're not in that world anymore. You don't have to do that. You can become actually wealthier if you don't do that. The other myth about Smith is that before he wrote The Wealth of Nations and became famous as Mr. Laissez-faire economist, he was a professor of moral philosophy at Edinburgh University, and his first book was called A Theory of Moral Sentiments. Sentiments are what we would call emotions. So it's sort of a theory of the origins of emotions, moral emotions. Why should we be moral? So this is like one of these great questions that we skeptics deal with. Why are we? If there's no God, why should we be moral? And so his answer was that we have an innate sense of morality. We deeply understand and intuit empathy and sympathy for other people. And without that, you can't have a civil society or a market economy. So in fact, contrary to Smith being sort of associated with this cutthroat, greedy, nasty, Gordon Gekko, greed is good view of capitalism, in fact, it was quite the opposite. And I think part of the problem I've figured out in the mind of the market here is that for the same reason people, I think, don't trust evolution on another level. When you ask people what you don't like about the theory, I don't believe in evolution. Why not? Usually they don't know anything about it. But one of the myths they hold is that it means we're just animals. We're not moral. That means we're just cutthroat, greedy, nasty, competitive, nature's red in tooth and claw. That comes from the fact that after The Origin of Species was published, Huxley and Herbert Spencer sort of won out in this battle against their opponents about whether natural selection was a force for elimination or a force for creation? Of course, it's both, but in sort of the competing world of ideas, Spencer's description of natural selection as survival of the fittest is still used today and still thought of, that an organism is fit if it's faster or it's stronger or it's a better predator and kill more animals. Well, it might be you're more fit if you're smaller, tiny, more well camouflaged, if you're more cooperative and pro-social and nice to your fellow group members, something like that. So I think one of the myths we need to debunk about evolution is that it's not just competitive, cutthroat, greedy, eliminative, extinction-based. That, in fact, there's a whole other side of it, and this is nicely written in a book called Mutual Aid in 1903, I think it was, by Peter Kropotkin, who lost the battle to Huxley and Spencer. That, in fact, what he saw in his native Russia was most social animals are incredibly cooperative and pro-social, and they get along just fine. And the stuff we see on nature channels, of animals constantly fighting and killing one another, and it looks like nature red in tooth and claw. Well, when you see the making of those films, or you talk to the filmmakers, it takes like weeks to get that 30-second shot. They just sit there and wait and wait and wait and wait. Nothing's happening. So those are two myths that I'm debunking here. That in fact, if evolution was only a force for elimination, it really was like that all the time. I don't think complex life could have evolved. Going all the way back to Lynn's prokaryotic cells becoming eukaryotic, none of that would have happened if there wasn't some other force at work there. And I think market economies would have imploded centuries ago if business people really were like Jeffrey Skilling and corporations were all like Enron. So I have a whole chapter contrasting and comparing Enron and Google and their corporate environments and what leads to the breakdown of moral systems within a corporation. And what gave me this whole idea for this little bit of the book was when I read Jeffrey Skilling's comment that his favorite book, Jeffrey Skilling was the CEO of Enron, his favorite book when he was a student at Harvard Business School was Richard Dawkins' The Selfish Gene. I thought, so he thinks evolution is this sort of selfish, nasty, brutish, cutthroat. And he had this incredible system at Enron where you had to be reevaluated every 6 months. And there was a required, like grading on a curve, there was a required 10% of employees had to be fired. So there's this constant tension in his company of, if you don't produce every single day, you're out. And you have to be out. Somebody has to go. And that sets up that kind of environment in which the whole system breaks down. And then, of course, people are going to cheat and lie and in that kind of environment. Most corporations are more like Google, don't be evil. And okay, so the problem to solve here from an evolutionary perspective is why should total strangers trade with one another in a market economy? So we begin with something like, if we make it more of a base question of why should anybody in any kind of environment, social environment, interact with anybody else in a positive fashion? Why not just kill everybody? As Jared Diamond likes to say, if you're in Papua New Guinea and you're a native Papua New Guinean and you walk down a path and you run into a stranger from another group, you should either turn or run or kill him. I mean, that's the natural inclination. There has to be something else in place to prevent that from happening. So from the selfish gene model, you start with kin selection. That is, the reason we're nice to other people that we're related to, actually, of course, is because this does help us get our genes into the next generation. Okay, fine, no problem. Those that are closely related to me, I'll be nice to them and cooperative and pro-social because that's actually good for my genes. So kin selection, that's fine. What about people I'm not related to, but that I know that are members of my group? Well, that we have reciprocal altruism for. I'll scratch your back if you'll scratch mine. That works well as long as it's not a one-shot deal. That is, if we have a lot of opportunities for interaction, we know each other over a long period of time. You know who in your group is a trustworthy, reliable, cooperative, pro-social member and who's a nasty, cheating bastard. And one way we know that is through gossip. Gossip is a means of gathering information and data about other people in order to assess their trustworthiness as a fellow group member. So one purpose of religion is it's a wonderful signaling system to tell your other fellow group members, look, you can count on me. I'm there every weekend. I'm not eating the meat, or I'm doing the thing on Saturday. I'm wearing this, or whatever the rituals are. It doesn't matter what the rituals are. It's the doing of the rituals that signals to your fellow group members,